It's great. Great neighborhood and great neighbors. So thank you to all of you for making this a good neighborhood. So I thought I would tell you the story about climate security during COVID, period of COVID and global disruption. And this brings together a lot of the work I've done across the course of my life. And I hope you'll find some of your own meaning and answers to your own questions within it. So Lynn has been kind enough to do the slides. So we'll start right there. And you see I'm affiliated with a couple of different organizations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center, now led by former Congresswoman Jane Harman. I'm sure many of you know her. And then a smaller Center for Climate and Security, whose board I chair and is kind of a leading up and coming think tank in this space. So, just to put it out there and frame it, kind of what are the greatest global challenges we face today? Well, obviously, COVID, it's COVID everything, right? And we're all where we are right now instead of together because of COVID. And so we have to battle that first and foremost. But climate is right there as a major global challenge that if we don't address in the next decade or so, we're going to leave a planet much worse off for our kids and our grandkids and future generations. So we're going to talk about that most of the time, but of course the economy, also a global challenge for everyone, and then our democracies. It's all on the line right now, including in our own country. And I'm sure all of you have already gone out to vote, so I won't say that, but we all should. And thank you for helping to support and ensure we continue to have a democratic country. On that, I'll just say, my parents are Holocaust refugees. They were born in Germany in the early 1930s. And they were among the fortunate few that escaped and were able to make it to the United States and create the American dream for themselves and our family, my siblings and I, and now our kids. And I'm very deeply troubled today that when if you go to the Holocaust Museum and in the first floor, it recounts the various laws that were put in place and the freedoms that were withdrawn during the 1930s from Germans, most particularly Jews and others, but Germans in particular, from freedom of speech to ability to work, that we've seen a lot of that here in our own country today. And that's why it's so important what we're doing next week. Okay, on to climate and security. Next slide, please, Lynn. Thank you so much. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is kind of at the convergence of what we call national security and climate security. And so most of you are of about my generation or so. So you remember the Cold War. And, that was the greatest battle. In fact, when I was coming of age, in the 70s, when I was in high school and then college, it was really the threat of a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union that we consider to be the most serious threat of the age. And so I really started my career in the nuclear field. And I wrote a book about nuclear weapons, the neutron bomb controversy when I was young. And I worked on nuclear weapons strategy and analysis at SAIC in its early days, a consulting firm here. And then I joined the Senate Armed Services Committee staff when Senator Sam Nunn was chairman, and I oversaw the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. Well, then we had the Cold War. The Cold War ended. Fortunately, the wall came down. And we entered a new era. Now, at the same time, if you look kind of at the lower part of the chart here, you see that in environmental laws and environmental awareness was growing in our own country and around the world. Major environmental laws were put in place. I mean, it goes back earlier than this timeline, some of them, the Endangered Species Act, the Antiquities Act, and others, but major laws in the 60s and 70s, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Air Act, the EPA was established. And then starting in the 70s and 80s, a whole series of international environmental agreements from the UN Environment Program, Montreal Protocol, the International Panel on Climate Change, the scientists who tell us what the state of climate risk is, and leading up into the Earth Summit Rio in 1992. And then you see an increasing convergence between national security risks and environmental security risks in the last several decades. Now we know that they really are deeply connected. So next slide, please. When I left the Pentagon in 2001, I joined the Center for Naval Analysis, a think tank like RAND that operates a federally funded and research and development center for the Navy, Marine Corps, and other parts of the government. And while I was there, I organized a group of leading retired generals and admirals that I had worked with during my time at the Pentagon to become the CNA Military Advisory Board. And we spent a year in 2006 and 2007 learning from the world's leading climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others. And we released the first report that really addressed the national security implications of climate change in 2007. And these are our main top lines here: that projected climate change poses a serious threat to America's national security, and climate change acts as a threat multiplier. That was a term I coined that's been widely used by everybody from President Obama to UN Secretary General Guterres and many, many others. And that climate change is going to add to tensions even in stable regions of the world. And that climate change, national security, and energy dependence are a related set of global challenges. Now, if you follow any of this even remotely, you might say, duh, Sherri, I know that. You didn't have to tell me that. But the fact is that, some 13, almost 14 years ago now, this wasn't obvious at all. And it was sort of a big aha moment, both for many in the national security and foreign policy community, and also in the climate and environmental community and general awareness. So I think the next slide is a little video that was done kind of on this theme that features many of us who did this work. Okay, let's play that. Thank you. Well, let's go back to the video, Lynn, if we can.
Okay, give me a second. Let me see what happened here. Sorry, just 1 second. And I think I need to reload that. As I mentioned to you last time we tried this, we also, okay, let's see. Got it. Okay.
Oops, but you have to screen share it, I think.
I will.
Things we take for granted.
Great.
Okay, just give me a second to get back to this now and screen share it. Every time I think I'm learning to do this, something that happens. So give me a second now and see, for some reason, okay, now I'm going to try and screen share it and see if it'll allow me to show the video, which I'm not 100% sure it will. So please bear with me on this. Okay. There you go.
We built society on this assumption of climate stability, and that stability is changing. All these things we take for granted, they're not just givens anymore.
The just released report on the Pentagon climate change and the challenges it's creating for the military. The latest report is global warming is driving weather to new levels of extreme.
99% of my intelligence told me there's an ambush waiting for me. I don't guess, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush. So the hell with the other 99%. As a member of the United States military of 30 plus years of service in uniform, climate change is what we call an accelerant to instability.
If you have an area that is already unstable and then has the additional challenge of water shortages or food shortages or disasters that makes people move, then you can start seeing conflict situations. Serious, deadly conflict, a full-blown civil war.
If we look around the world today, we can already see conflict and climate play right under the headlines that we're reading.
A new study finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria as a consequence of human interference.
Fragile social systems just need one more shock to tip them over the edge into social breakdown, into war. globally interconnected system is a failure of imagination.
The flip side of the climate threat is the energy and resilience opportunity. As a soldier, we're always looking to have an edge on the future.
Okay, well, at least for me, that sound was a little muffled, and maybe it was for you as well, but I hope it gave you a flavor of, that's the trailer from about a 90-minute film called The Age of Consequences, which I believe you can still find on Netflix or elsewhere. That's a dramatization of climate and security. So now we'll take a bit of a dive into some aspects of that. So first, what are those climate, what we call threat multipliers? Well, first, that global temperatures are rising dramatically around the world. We see it even where we live here. You see it most dramatically in the Arctic, which is warming the poles are warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. They hit temperatures of 100 degrees in Siberia this summer and 70 degrees in Svalbard in Norway. Permafrost is thawing and the sea ice is retreating, and temperatures are warming. So this is occurring all around the world at different rates, but very consistently higher. Drought, a major factor of climate change, prolonged drought across much of the Sahel, the Middle East, parts of South Asia. Even our own country is in drought across parts of our South and Southwest, which connects into the next threat multiplier, the fires. You all know, you probably have kids or family or friends out in the West who suffered through the storms, the firestorms of this summer, the bomb cyclones. And this is only getting worse as a result of the rising temperatures and the drought that plagues much of the West and continues even up into Alaska, parts of Siberia, and elsewhere around the world. Sea level rise is on the march pretty much everywhere around the world. We have major urban areas that will be completely different within several decades. From my own home of New York City to Miami, New Orleans, these are cities that will look much different a quarter century from now if we don't act quickly to make them more resilient to sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme weather events. Flooding is occurring across much of the country and the world, flooding in the Midwest in particular, flooding across much of South Asia now. And we'll talk about that. And then the storms, the extreme weather events. Today we're in Hurricane Zeta. We've hardly ever reached beyond the alphabet to new named storms. And with each storm, there are features, characteristics of them that make them more intense and potentially more devastating than the storms we grew up with. Okay, next slide. And of course, we can't forget disease. So, now we have the COVID deaths that are mounting so dramatically around the world. We haven't beaten this virus yet. Hopefully we will. And next slide, because some of that can be traced to the fact that we haven't managed to successfully control the biodiversity elements of this. And so we've got an increasing connection between zoonotic diseases and human diseases. And there's much more we need to understand about how what happened in that wet market in Wuhan that led to this creation and spread of COVID. But there's no question that human continued interference with global biodiversity, from deforestation to illegal and poorly regulated wildlife trade, to our own pharmaceuticals that build up microbial resistance, and other ways in which we farm and fish, along with climate change, have created a clash of COVID and climate. And this isn't even new. This is from a UN environmental report from 2016. Okay, next slide. All right, and that all right, amounts to the fact that disaster risks are rising around the world because people are increasingly exposed to hazards of, the extreme weather event like the hurricane. And then in many parts of our own country, but particularly in vulnerable regions around the world, there are exposures, they're not well protected, their buildings aren't secure. And then you have vulnerable populations who are already on the margins. And that leads to, the direct effects of mortality, displacement of people, and then damage to infrastructure and assets. And then, the indirect effects, of course, people losing their jobs and their livelihoods. And then over time, these effects are spilling over into the next generation, also affecting supply chains. And then the migration we see today, much of it driven by climate impacts and the greatest global migration since World War II. Next. Okay, and here you just see the mounting disaster costs. So we're already paying for this. People say, well, why should we, we don't want to lose jobs by dealing with climate change. Well, we're already paying for it. And we're paying for it in the form of these weather and climate disasters in the form of those threat multipliers, which we discussed earlier, recounted here on this slide. Okay, next slide. And this is just this year. These are 2020 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters that occurred just in this year from these various types of events put together by our current government and the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. It speaks to itself. Okay, next slide. And because I know many of you probably like me, eat a lot of fish, we like our protein. Just to remind you that our fisheries globally are in danger. Many of them are being overfished all around the world. And that so that's one thing, illegal and unregulated fishing. The other is the change in ocean ecosystems with warming temperatures and ocean acidification that as fish stocks migrate and move with the temperature change, their nutrient levels could decrease. And that also is a major global concern. Next slide, please. Okay, so, all of these threat multipliers we've talked about on the top really have all these social and security impacts that we look at on the bottom, from interstate conflict, population displacement and migration, increasing resource conflicts, economic sectors that are completely destabilized, like the coffee crop in Colombia, critical security infrastructure at risk. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Political instability, extremist groups, and failing agriculture. So now I'm going to do next slide, we're going to do a few little regional case studies. I could go through every continent of the world on this, but given our time constraint, I just picked a few for our discussion today, and I'm happy to discuss any other parts of the world with you in the Q&A. So if we go to the Middle East and we look at Syria in particular, which is, been the greatest conflict of the modern era, and we look at the timeline that led to the uprising and the civil unrest, and then the civil war, and then the addition of major powers into Syria, you have to see that on the left side of this slide, there was drought occurring in 1988 to 1993, and then again from 98 to 2000, and then again from 2000 to 2005 to 2010, that really was one of the driving factors in what has become the deadliest conflict of the modern era. So as the years of drought build up, like biblical times, farmers and herders who had lived peaceably in the countryside were then unable to continue their livelihoods, farming, herding. They begin to move towards the urban areas. That leads to civil unrest. There's insufficient jobs, insufficient space for families. Of course, Assad takes advantage of that, and political turmoil occurs. And then ISIS develops and other political factions. And then we have a series of deadly conflicts, the Syrian uprising, and the rest, as we say, is history. So next timeline, that's an example. Next slide, please. Right. Of the ways in which, and this was done by my colleague at GW, who used to work with me at the Pentagon and at CNA, very smart man named Marcus King, has looked at how water has become weaponized in conflicts in the modern time. I mean, there are biblical antecedents to this, but again, he's looked particularly at Iraq, Syria, and now at other places in the Horn of Africa. But water is being used to destroy as strategic targets. It's being used to deny access to military targets in the battle space, to coerce vulnerable populations as an instrument of psychological terrorism. Of course, you can't live without water. So if water's withheld, you can subdue the population and make them compliant, and also as extortion. Next slide, please. So now if we sort of continuing on the water theme here, in Africa and climate, the drought, water insecurity, and the unpredictability also of changing climate conditions has magnified the instability and also the terrorist challenges across much of Africa. And we've seen just in the last month or two that ISIS, Boko Haram, and others are reforming with renewed strength across much of this region, while we have not been paying much attention in recent years. But in countries like Mali and Niger, which also have among the youngest populations in the world, most of their population is under 25. They also suffer from all the drought, desertification, overgrazing, soil erosion, inadequate water supply. The formerly abundant Lake Chad Basin, which used to supply 4 countries that straddled it with ample water for food, fishing, and agriculture, has been in prolonged drought, leading to food insecurity. Boko Haram on the Nigeria side taking advantage of communities, and Somalia on the Horn of Africa in a very strategic location also suffers greatly from food insecurity, land degradation, and drought, to the point that one of the generals I used to work with on the CNA Military Advisory Board, would report how they would just, they were so food insecure on land, and they weren't a native fishing people, but they would break through their own coral reef just to get out to the outer water so they could gather fish, adding to their long-term environmental woes. And these are just the places where we have deployed American forces for security with the growth in the terrorist threat. So the two are very much connected here in this continent. Next slide, please. Okay, well, now we'll go to another part of the world, to the Arctic. And this is an area I spent quite a bit of my time working on. I have for a number of years. It's where climate has really opened a whole new ocean in our lifetime. Any of you who worked on Arctic matters during the Cold War, it was really, in my early days when I was at the Pentagon, Arctic matters meant helping Russia denuclearize after the end of the Cold War. And so I led an Arctic military environmental cooperation program during my 8 years at the Pentagon with Russia, Norway, and many of our other allies in the Nordic countries, where we were helping Russia get rid of its nuclear weapons and safely manage liquid waste streams from decommissioned and often sunken Russian submarines in the Kola Peninsula, close to the borders of Norway, who was concerned about its prized fishing grounds being potentially contaminated from leaking Russian submarines. But now today we find that there's increased competition for resources and for influence across the region. There is along the vast Russian northern sea route, which runs along most of its coastline. If you can see the green line on this slide, the northern sea route, Russia, which gathers, yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, Lynn. About 20% of its GDP historically from the Arctic, and really views it has its own identity as an Arctic nation in a way that the US has not consistently had. I mean, we are an Arctic nation, but you could spend your whole life in Washington and really never know that. But that's not true in Russia. They've set vast industrial complexes in the Russian Arctic through the Cold War period. They're extracting energy and minerals. And now Putin has set very aggressive targets for shipping across the northern sea route. And they are gaining investment for that from China and others. While, okay, I'm going to get to China in just a moment. While the central Arctic route, also, which is not open right now, but could be in the future and could significantly shorten shipping times from Shanghai to ports in Europe. So we really have a whole new world that's opened up in the Arctic about influence, shipping, energy, and then we have indigenous communities that live there as well, and the vast reaches of the Arctic that are changing. The sea ice no longer, even at the central North Pole, when Russia recently went to test its new Arctic nuclear-powered icebreaker, couldn't get proper measurements because the sea ice was so thin this year that it couldn't properly measure to normal levels of thickness. Next slide, please. And China also has some very significant polar ambitions. Some of you may follow its Belt and Road Initiative, where China seeks to build this vast network of sea lanes and rail and road lanes across Europe, from Asia into Europe, in its global quest for resources and now influence. But it's also issued its first Arctic policy about 2 years ago now, looking to shorten shipping times, collaborating with Russia on the northern sea route, with an eye towards eventual use of that transpolar route that could result in the ultimate prize, the fish, when there is a viable fishery in the central Arctic Ocean, which there is not yet, but it's probably coming. Next slide, please. So what keeps me up at night when I think about the clash of climate and national security? We did this with an exercise, a simulation with the National Academy of Sciences and Sandia National Labs last year, where we looked at the possibility in 2050 of a Russian nuclear icebreaker, which you see pictured on this slide, along with the graphs on the left show from the IPCC the increasingly open shipping lanes, transarctic shipping routes in the future under various climate scenarios of a Russian Arctic nuclear-powered icebreaker colliding maybe with its Chinese liquid natural gas fueled vessel, an accident, lack of information. We know that Russia does not have the best nuclear safety record, from Chernobyl to the sinking of the Kursk submarine. They have historically not released information in a timely way. There's a lot we might not know. So what do we need to know, both to protect the environment and the ecosystem, rescue people who might be at risk, and understand how to manage this as an international security incident? Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about climate security risks here at home, and then what we can do about it, because it's not all a downer. I always like to end on a high note. Okay, next slide, please. So if we, thank you, Lynn. So, just to talk about what it means in terms of our own military, our own forces here at home. So we train like we fight. We take our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine. We do most of our training at military bases in the West, Southwest. where the what we call the black flag days, the high temperature degree days of heat and humidity over 90 degrees are increasing. And already in the decade of 2008 to 2018, cost us $1 billion in lost training days to the effects of heat. And those numbers are already growing. And there are parts of the world, like the Middle East shown on this slide, where it just may be too hot to deploy safely, and where people are going to have trouble living without air conditioning in the future when we see the temperatures rising in places like India and parts across the Middle East, well over 110, even to 120 degrees Fahrenheit at certain points. Okay, next slide. We also have military bases at risk around the country, particularly a lot here on the East Coast. We have many bases subject to sea level rise, storm surge, extreme weather events. This map shows you military bases all around the country, study done by the Department of Defense, from wind, drought, wildfire, extreme temperatures. And this is something we've actually known for some time. Next slide. And just to look at that in a little more detail, if we look down here at Norfolk, Virginia, where we have the greatest concentration of military bases of anywhere in our country and probably in the world, we've got, whoops, sorry about that. Okay, we back here, there we go. We've got Navy bases, Air Force bases, Marine Corps, Army bases. We've got a NATO headquarters. We've got Coast Guard. We've got many others, and most of them are in this area that is red, likely to be flooded in an extreme weather event. Already, this area experiences sunny day flooding, where people can't always get to from their home to work on the base pre-COVID when they went on base. Or some of them still have to go on base. So, and just last week, Virginia Governor Northam released a new coastal resilience planning framework, which is led in part by a terrific woman who now, who retired admiral, one of the first Navy admirals to command a surface ship, a destroyer, Ann Phillips, who is now Governor Northam's chief resilience officer. And she helped and others helped develop this new coastal resilience framework. So I'm somewhat optimistic that they'll be able to combat these challenges in the future. But it's a big one. And we see this at different scales at other places around the country. Next slide. Okay, and just in the last year or two, we've had major hurricanes devastate major military bases, including Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, $3 to $5 billion. Hangars completely damaged, and a number of F-22s, big fighters that were damaged in that. And then Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, also subject to a Hurricane Florence and flooding and extreme weather. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the other major base last year that suffered damage was in the middle of the country, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And then you can see the changes in heavy precipitation, observed changes over the last approximately 100 or so years and how that's changed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what are we trying to do about it? Next slide. Well, what do we know? What can we say? You know, the military is already looking at how to climate proof from its bases to changing its energy mix with solar and renewables. Some of that we learned the hard way during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where 70% of our logistics, our food, our fuel and water to the front, and that put a lot of soldiers in trucks at risk from improvised explosive devices. And so our military went to work looking at ways of repowering our bases with renewables. We also have new technologies being developed to better predict risk in a changing climate. You see at the bottom a sail drone, that's a wind-powered ocean drone that's helping us take better measurements of changing ocean characteristics that can be used by everybody from the Navy to the National Science Foundation and other governments. Next slide, please. And as I said, we talked about energy a little bit, new ways of refueling, new innovations, even wind power for our bases up in the Arctic, as you see up there, a new perspective on wind energy during a Navy ice exercise a couple of years ago. Next slide. And then earlier this year, I formed with the former Dutch Chief of Defense and now over 50 military leaders, and really we have over 30 countries who have joined together in a new international military council on climate and security, because military leaders around the world really recognize now how important this challenge is, and that militaries, which are often the largest single energy user in their nation, it's true here in the US, the US Department of Defense is the largest single energy user at a little less than 1% of total US energy. So its buying power and its power of innovation can really make a difference. Next slide, please. Okay, and we issued our first World Climate Security Report earlier this year, and these are some of the main impacts that we identified. Okay, we've talked about the Arctic and the Middle East. We've got a lot of extreme weather events here in the Americas. There's no doubt that the migration we're seeing from Central and South America, some of it is due to both increased state fragility, which is driven in part by drought, food insecurity, water insecurity, rampant storms, the loss of the coffee crop, particularly in certain countries. And again, we could do a whole section on the Indo-Pacific and particularly China controlling the headwaters of Asia and challenges to water security throughout that region, as well as increasing extreme weather. Okay, I'm sorry, I think you might be hearing my dog. I'm hoping somebody else in my house will let the dog out. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. All right, getting to the end here. So imagine, if we had known about Pearl Harbor and 9/11, what we could have done to prepare, and the challenge is really on us, because we know that the climate risk is mounting, and we have time to mobilize a major effort. And I will say one of the presidential contenders next week has a major effort in his climate plan that will help us mobilize not only to transform our energy system to help mitigate some of the greenhouse gas emissions, but also to prepare the kind of predictive capabilities that we need, and also to integrate this into our defense and foreign policy planning. Okay, next slide. And so these are a couple of different pieces I've written over the last year or so with some of my colleagues. Militaries do know how to prepare for these extreme risks if we just let them go after it. Even though there hasn't been much leadership in this administration on this, there are still people in the Department of Defense who are looking at it. The Army just recently released a climate risk assessment tool, and there are other similar efforts. Okay, next slide. This is one with another colleague. We're already seeing these climate threats. And then last one. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about natural security. So climate, of course, has been most of the topic today, but really if we broaden this out to natural security, we also include ocean health and biodiversity, which we touched on, but really are part of a broader natural security strategy we need as we reset our global leadership. And I think with that is the very last slide with my contact info, and I'm happy now to have some Q&A with you all. Thank you for taking the time to be here this evening.
Okay, so we are happy to, if somebody has questions, we are happy to take questions. Let me try and view you if you'd like to raise your hands if you have questions, or
you can put it in the chat, whatever's good for you.
or put it in the chat. I'm happy to read it if you prefer. Are there any questions or comments about what Sherri has shared with us in this very comprehensive program on climate change and COVID? So if anybody has any comments or questions, I look forward to hearing from you. And oh, I see Henry. Okay, Henry, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Thank you. There you
Okay,
go.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, just a quick question, but I was wondering when you were talking about the route through the Russian seaports that are opening up as the ice melts. So would that have an effect on changing the balance of power in the world? Because if that was the fastest shipping route for Chinese goods, wouldn't that give the Russians a huge advantage over the rest of the world to control that route?
Well, and that's certainly what Putin is hoping. I mean, you know, Russia overall is a declining economy and a status quo Arctic power. But opening the Northern Sea route to increase global shipping is one way in which they hope to revive their economy. Now, it's going to be some time. It's not like it's happening next year. It's still treacherous and it's a toll road. So, you know, but on the other hand, the Chinese may be just as happy to pay Russia as to go through the Straits of Malacca and the Straits of Hormuz, which the U.S. Really, you know, the U.S. guarantees freedom of navigation. The Chinese have always chafed at that. You know, there are many points of contest within the South China Sea between the U.S. and China and other countries now. So China is working increasingly closely with Russia across the Arctic. Both they provide the investment, the financing, they get training on how to operate in the Arctic, and they get access to the region. And then Russia gets, you know, income and influence. I think their long-term ambition, China's long-term ambition, is perhaps the Central Arctic shipping route, but that's many more decades away before that's open. So yes, that's what our future could look like.
Thank you. Carol Kelly, I believe you had a question.
Yes, I do. First, Sherri, let me thank you so much on behalf of both Georgetown Village and Hillendale for your expertise and providing all this information to us tonight. You know, I've known you for a long time in the community. We've never had a serious discussion like this, and it's wonderful to know that somebody of your stature and caliber is really on top of these issues and trying to make a national and international difference. So thank you for that. My question is this. You talked a lot about the nature of the climate change problem and what might happen if there's a change in administration kind of generally. What do you think, and there's often a lot of focus in an administration on what should be done in the first 100 days and perhaps what needs to be done in the first year, giving advice to an incoming Biden administration, should there be one, and understanding all the competing priorities any administration is going to have in 2021. What do you think really needs to be done on the climate front in the first 100 days, and then beyond that, perhaps the next year?
Well, in the first even less than 100 days, a President Biden would rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement because the Trump administration plans to withdraw on November 4th, which is the first date legally they can act to withdraw it. So if Trump is not elected, a President-elect Biden is going to declare to the world that the U.S. intends to stay in Paris. That's really the first thing. Then, his whole economic plan, the Build Back Better plan, is really infused with growing jobs in the new energy economy, putting people back to work post-COVID by making that clean energy transition in a variety of ways. So first, it's about those jobs, everything from capping methane wells at fracking sites, to building microgrids, new batteries for electric cars, various renewables, wind, solar, and others. And then second, it's about the investments that we need to get there. And massive, I think he envisions, and it's on the website, you know, a massive investment in R&D, science and technology to get us some of those new technologies that are on the horizon, but aren't there yet, like batteries for storage, batteries for cars, batteries to store your solar power at your house, whole ways of completely transitioning into his goal of reaching net zero in the electricity sector by 2035 and net zero across the economy by 2050. Ambitious goals that will, but potentially realistic if the US commits to that kind of investment of the type that we did in the stimulus and certainly earlier eras of the Manhattan Project, the moonshot.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. If I may.
I see Charles has a question. Charles, go for it, and then
Okay.
Martha.
Sherri, I lived for many years in Miami, which has to be one of the ground zeros of this whole problem. You know, I saw Miami Beach grow. I saw the Fontainebleau being built. And I can just imagine, knowing that area of the country so well, the impact on real estate, tourism, construction, schools, sports, etc. So the economic consequences are gigantic, gigantic. And I don't know what that city is going to do, especially Miami Beach, to say nothing of the other sea level cities around the country like New York, Manhattan, places like that. So, I mean, a Manhattan project may be the answer, but what is the short-term, let's say 5-year plan that will rescue or maybe mitigate the damage or the impact that this horrible problem will have on localities like that?
Yeah, Tom, you're right. You know, I grew up as a kid. My grandparents lived in Miami Beach, and I remember going to the Fontainebleau and those other great places down.
Did you live on the beach?
They lived off Collins Avenue, and we used to take that
Really?
little tramway over to the Fontainebleau when
No
they had.
kidding. What street in Collins?
Oh my goodness, I'd have to look it up.
Near the Fontainebleau?
Yeah, but you know they had those. That was in the era of those cabana clubs down there.
Oh, yeah.
So well before it became, you know, trendy South Beach.
So be.
Yeah. But yes, it's you know, the keys, for example, many of the keys are already not as you know, not as inhabitable as they used to be. Some of the towns south of Miami, they experience already regular sunny day flooding. In one of the very prosperous, I'm forgetting the name now, just south of Miami. I did an event with him at the Council on Foreign Relations a few years ago. The former mayor, you know, was talking about how they can't get, sometimes their very expensive yachts can't get out of the inner harbor because the sea level has risen too much for them to go under the bridge. So except at certain tide levels, and you know, he finds an octopus in the basement of, you know, one of his local buildings. So that image of the octopus in the basement is just really something to me. But so the mayor of Miami and most of Miami-Dade County, they've come together with a very active effort to recognize climate effects. And to build resilience around them. Now, it takes a public-private kind of whole of community effort. Just in the last year or so, I think you've seen real estate prices reflect the increasing risk levels, and insurance companies not wanting, you know, the federal flood insurance program is completely inadequate to the need. You
may have seen pictures of the people of Miami Beach putting up sandbags, even now,
right,
near Collins Avenue.
Right.
Which for those of you who do not know Miami Beach, Collins Avenue is maybe a couple of blocks away from the ocean, or a few, maybe 3 or 4 blocks at the most. And the water is already coming into the inland, into Miami Beach. So I can imagine how tourists would be deterred from going to Miami Beach on vacation if they're going to have to grapple with walking in little puddles throughout the city and places like Lincoln Road, as you know.
Lincoln Road. Yeah, exactly. Lincoln Road.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, so what's happening is the tourism and real estate industries are all being affected, in addition, of course, to COVID. And they may, you know, after COVID, some of this may not come back, because who's going to make those investments now? Because they may not be able to realize the returns in future years. And so what you'll have is people will relocate, and you'll have some of what people call sort of managed retreat. It probably will be, you know, insufficient to the problem. But we already see communities having to relocate in the US. There's a community, Ile St. Charles in the Bayou of Louisiana, and another one in coastal Alaska called Newtok, both of which have had to completely relocate because of rising seas.
Right. Well, thank you. Very informative, by the way.
Good.
Thank you, Charles.
So,
Do you view Manhattan in the same light as South Florida?
oops.
In terms of the exposure to the great perils of
No,
this?
thank you.
Well, you see, the difference, part of the difference, Charles, is that after Superstorm Sandy, when New York City was very unprepared, they invested in making that city more resilient in ways that that Miami hasn't yet been able to do. They got massive amounts of federal money. They really built that city back to a higher standard, both through natural and built infrastructure. Now, it's not to say it's not vulnerable, but Miami and some of the other cities have not, and then they really built up, and they have a very climate aware, climate sensitive, both governor, mayors, you know, Mayor Bloomberg, all the governors and mayors in recent years have been very, what would you say, climate forward. And while the mayors and the county leaders in Miami, South Florida are, the governor is not, and neither are the senators. So they've had kind of a mixed level of support there.
Thank you very much, Sherri. Very
Thank you.
informative.
I think Martha and then Sally.
Yes, well, this has been so informative because I've always thought about the tragedies of climate change. I have a house on the Eastern Shore that we have definitely lost shoreline, but I never thought of it as being a major factor in the migrations that we're seeing all over the world. But I'm thinking of communicating the dangers in a way to somebody living in Nebraska will understand. New York and Miami are still a long ways away. Looking at those magazine articles that you presented, it says military involved with climate change, etc. It would be more meaningful if you say and it's interesting that one of them was in Nebraska, I'm assuming near the Mississippi or the Missouri. But if those articles had said, U.S. in danger of losing major bases, or major bases may be destroyed by climate change, and then those articles focused on someplace in the Midwest, someplace on the West Coast, including the East Coast. I mean, I was quite truthfully, and I'm a lifelong resident of the area, shocked with about your map about the Norfolk Newport News area. I can see all of that being non-functional in another 50 years. And that, I think our military vulnerability in those articles should be emphasized. It's hard for people to think about unrest and migration in Syria being caused because people don't have enough to eat. Well, I just lost my Zoom. Maybe you lost my picture. But anyway, that's that. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very good comments. Very, very excellent. very excellent comments, and I really appreciate your sharing that perspective.
Okay.
And
Thank
we
you.
sometimes say
Sally?
what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's changing agricultural patterns in Nebraska and places across the Midwest. Farmers know about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sally?
Yeah. Hi, Sherri. This is your neighbor, Sally.
Hi, Sally.
Great presentation. I didn't know you had all this talent and important positions in trying to deal with our environment and security. So thank you for all that. I'm involved somewhat in this issue, but interestingly enough, not here where I live permanently in Washington, but in Rehoboth. We have a home there, and I founded an environmental nonprofit to save our 3 freshwater lakes.
Oh, good.
And we know that Rehoboth, I mean, I had to do a lot of research to make a presentation to their commissioners for their comprehensive development plan. And what we're concerned about is what's going to happen to Rehoboth, because when they have storms, storm water is a real issue, and it affects our lakes as well. And we have presented them with some ideas about infrastructure and things that will mitigate some of that. But I mean, if you look at the OSHA predictions, we may have 7 feet of ocean rising along that of the Atlantic and 3 feet inward in towards the land and towards the lake. So they're a little bit behind, but they also have a resiliency program with adjoining neighborhoods and they're the state DENREC organization to really begin addressing this, but it's really kind of late coming to the dance, so to speak. But, you know, interestingly, because I've been involved in that, I really don't know what's happening in our jurisdictions here in Washington and our surrounding areas. And certainly Washington is a key area for security for the nation. And how are we handling these climate change issues locally, I guess is the question.
Well, that's a good question. So we have we've got seawalls built in there around around the Jefferson Memorial and Georgetown when the Potomac rises. We have a very, because we have this aging water infrastructure in the U.S. in the Washington area. Any of you know, when you go walk down on the along the river, along the canal, you see the signs for the combined sewer overflow. Now, much of that's been upgraded in the last decade so that it's better and because as the sea levels rise and you're more at risk when you have an extreme storm, a high rain event, to get this combined sewer overflow, which means you're getting the sewage runoff, into the local waters, which is very bad for, water pollution. So we're trying to, that's improved some in the last decade. The former head of the water, or WASA, who was actually a law school classmate of mine, was very aggressive, forgetting his name right now, but he was moved very forward to capture the federal funds and do the planning to do it. It's a big construction project. The other aspects of it are our waterfront development. We've had a lot of waterfront development, which is positive. And I think most of it has been done in a way that recognizes, like if you were in Amsterdam or Dutch cities or other Nordic cities, that you have to do a design that doesn't try to just create barriers and keep water out, because it won't stay out. The Dutch learned that the hard way in their floods in the 50s, where they lost lives. And now they're, world leaders in design with water, really, so that if you go, the last time you were in the Netherlands, you could see major buildings that let the water flow under them and as the sea. So some of that is coming in the US, probably not as fast as it should. We also still have some very old military bases along parts of the Anacostia and Potomac waterfront.
Yeah.
We've got the Navy Yard, we've got across there, you've got that whole big complex that runs from it's used to be called Bowling Air Force Base, and you've got many, you got a Naval Research Lab, you got a whole bunch of stuff over there, and that a lot of that stuff is very old, and the problem with the old buildings there is they're not well maintained and they're highly at risk. And in fact, a colonel that worked for me, she was the head of a rising star in the Air Force, and she was the base commander there at the old Bowling Air Force Base last year. And she really tried to make some major improvements, but these are multi-year projects. You know, it doesn't happen just in 1 or 2 years. So, but you'll see, I think you're going to see a lot more preference for natural and green infrastructure. If this plan released by Governor Northam last week, to me, reading it was quite remarkable, because he stated in it their preference for what they called green infrastructure. They use that term in this coastal master planning, preference for green infrastructure where possible. And that's going to start shifting the presumptions. You know, we've had historically in our construction, the way we've done construction and engineering in the US is a preference for the built environment. You know, and that's what got us all screwed up down in New Orleans and the Mississippi, as we over-engineered the river, you know, and in the Everglades too. We had engineered solutions rather than looking first at the natural design. So I think we're now going to you'll see a whole movement to try to catch up through natural design features. You know, Sally, when you talk about those freshwater lakes at Rehoboth, you know, what you're probably trying to do is protect them from saline intrusion. Right. As the salt water comes, you know, creeps in the groundwater further, what you really want to do, because otherwise the chemical composition of the lake deteriorates, and then it's no longer, you know, what it was before. And so designing those, then you have to go back to the source of the problem, which is you got to go back to where the salt water's coming in, and what do you need to do in terms of beach restoration and the whole coastline to reduce the likelihood of that salt water intruding into the freshwater lakes.
Yeah, I am from, we actually know something about the green infrastructure, which was part of our presentation. And I mean, the fortunate thing is a good part of Rehoboth is just about sea level, but where our house is, we're 60 feet above sea level on another lake. I mean, a lake, there are 3 lakes. And these lakes also have the distinction of being the closest to the Atlantic Ocean on the eastern seaboard.
Oh,
so
wow.
They could be very vulnerable. Well, it's a great presentation, and I'm so happy to know what you do. But I also want to say, just to everyone watching, Sir Attenborough has a wonderful documentary on Netflix.
Yes.
And he started to work on all of these issues back in the 1950s, and has done charts about how we have progressed in terms of destroying our climate. And then he also offers recommendations that all of us could use just individually and in our own lives. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I think I'm going to give Tom Kabukian the last word. He said, a fantastic overview of a complicated challenge, witnessing and living through a lack of sacrifice by many Americans during the current pandemic. Is our federal government really set up to tackle climate change? I threw you a softball at the end there.
Yeah, well, see, here's the thing, Tom and everyone. It's you framed it. If you frame it as sacrifice, people don't want to make it, right? But it's really opportunity. That's what I said in the Age of Consequences film clip I showed you. But it's also it is the opportunity for new and better jobs. It's the opportunity, you know, there's a whole industry of clean tech entrepreneurs now. There's a whole coming sector in climate tech that's really just getting started. It's really software, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, that's about better being able to predict, you know, what those localized impacts are so that people can make smart decisions where they live. Because you can't take a global climate model and do any kind of local decision making. So I think it's, I think we have to see this as an opportunity to grow. As Biden says, you know, when he thinks of climate change, he thinks of jobs. And that's what we're going to be doing. I mean, I hope we're going to have the chance to do it. It's going to be a big job, but there are going to be a lot of jobs in doing it. And some of it might even be the modern era, New Deal conservation, energy and conservation core. where we create jobs for youth and others who need that employment and put them to work to put our country back to work.
I hope you're going to work in the administration, Sherri.
First, we got to get them elected. I guess you know how I voted.
I feel good.
Careful, we're a 501c3. I don't want to go there.
Okay, yes, no. I didn't. You saw my presentation. All my entities are 501c3s too.
Right
I
down the-
appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone for coming. I particularly want to thank Sherri for an excellent presentation. And a special thanks to Emily Summers and Carol Kelly, who have really arranged all these fabulous speakers for us. I just want to tell you that coming December 3rd, we have our anniversary celebration, as you can see in my backdrop tonight. And we invite you all to participate. We will be having an excellent presentation brief by Jose Andre talking about how villages and actually how all of us can make a difference in the world. I hope you will join us. We will be inviting you by virtue of the fact you've attended this program. We have your emails and we will be sending out email invitations, and we hope you'll enjoy us for a fun evening. We don't usually get to invite the community to our anniversary celebration. So this is kind of special, you know, it's like a silver lining to COVID, that we can open our celebration to the community and to those of you who have not yet joined the village, but are part of our greater community by virtue of attending these events. So I thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you at our future events and at our anniversary party on December 3rd. So watch our website, watch your email box, because you'll be hearing from us, and have a lovely evening. And Sherri, thank you again. This was really a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
You're welcome, Lynn. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
Have a nice evening.
Bye, friends and
everyone.
neighbors.
Good night.